And welcome to this evening's Regional History Colloquium. I'm Tom Ryan, President and CEO of Lancaster History, and I would like to encourage all of you, as Emily already has, to take advantage of the Q&A feature and send us your questions as the lecture proceeds. When our speaker has concluded her formal presentation, we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as we can. It is indeed a pleasure to welcome our guest tonight, Leslie Stainton. Leslie is no stranger to us. She has spoken previously at Lancaster History, and we're delighted to have you back. Leslie grew up in Lancaster and first worked at the Fulton Theater when she was 12 years old. She volunteered to usher for a play. She went on then to work at the Fulton for several years, both on stage, backstage, and behind the scenes in the development office. Her fascination with the Fulton led her to write a history memoir about the theater entitled Staging Ground, An American Theater and Its Ghosts, published by Penn State Press and released in 2014. Leslie is also the author of Lorca, A Dream of Life, a biography of the Spanish playwright and poet Federico Garcia Lorca. And she recently completed a book about her slaveholding ancestors, the Scarlets of Georgia. A two-time Fulbright Award recipient, she holds a BA in drama from Franklin Marshall College and an MFA in dramaturgy from the University of Massachusetts. Leslie joins us tonight from Ann Arbor, Michigan, where she is a past University of Michigan faculty member. Leslie, welcome, and we're delighted to have you with us tonight. I will rejoin the conversation when her presentation is over, and we'll engage in a conversation using your questions.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me back. And let's get the show on the road. I'm going to try to, this is always my scary part, bringing up PowerPoint. So, but I think it's working. I want to give a quick heads up, and this is partly because I'm from Ann Arbor, where this topic is much in the news, but I do want to give a little warning that I have some images of racial stereotypes that you will find offensive. Specifically, I'm talking about blackface. I don't in any way mean to suggest that I endorse or approve of the practice of blackface by showing these images, but I do want to present the full history of this remarkable building, the Fulton, in its rich and unsettling complexity. I can't imagine any building could get to be as old as the Fulton is in this country without having some ugliness in its history, along with the many beautiful things. And I am a firm believer that we need to uncover and address that ugliness if we're going to move forward from where we are right now. So that's my caveat. The actual title of this talk is A Perfect Gem, the Fulton Theater and What It Means to Lancaster. And I do hope that the phrase, what is it, Old Lady of Prince Street, dies a quick death after this, and I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. But this title comes from a comment that was made by the actor Edward Davenport at the reopening of a renovated Fulton Opera House in 1873. By my count, we are now at the fifth major, that's five, major renovation of the Fulton Theater since its opening in 1852. Got this working. Davenport's precise words were, "Fulton Hall is certainly a perfect little gem." Well, in light of the newly expanded Fulton Theater complex, I thought it was probably a good idea to take the word little out of the phrase. Davenport also called Fulton the most beautiful temple of art in the United States. Well, if you're here tonight, you don't need me to tell you how exceptional the Fulton is as a place. But what I find most exceptional about the Fulton is that it has endured for more than 150 years. That was not a given. At its heyday as a roadhouse in the United States in the late 19th century, there were roughly 4,000 theaters like the Fulton all across the country. Today, there are 300. Only 300 of those have survived, and the Fulton is one of them. The death knell for so many of these theaters, as I'm sure many of you know, were the movies. And the Fulton was not immune from that. And many of you will remember that for years, the Fulton served as a movie theater. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who remembers going there in the 1960s. I'm going to date myself, and seeing the peeling paint and the tattered upholstery. I came across an urban legend the other day that if you went to the Fulton in the 60s to the movies, you were told that you should take cheese with you to feed the mice. And I can remember probably when I was around 12 or 13, I went to a movie once. I got so bored, I scooched down in my seat, I stuck my legs up in the air, and I started bicycling. And the weirdest thing is, like, nobody stopped me. I don't know if it's because there was nobody else in the building, or they just didn't care. It was that kind of a place. There were serious plans to turn the Fulton into a parking garage. In fact, one idea was just to leave the facade up and put floors for cars behind it. Mercifully, Mayor Kendig Bear, thank you, Mayor Bear, refused to issue a building permit, and the Fulton sort of squeaked by. In 1952, a journalist named Joe Kingston from Lancaster published a series of, I think it was 6 articles. He was so desperate to convince the people of Lancaster that they had a perfect gem in their midst that he did this 6-part history of the Fulton, but he made stuff up. He just fabricated entire things out of whole cloth. He was, I think, because he just was so desperate to save this theater. One scene in particular, it really disappoints me that it wasn't true. He told readers that James Buchanan and Thaddeus Stevens were in the theater together one night watching John Wilkes Booth perform on stage. John Wilkes Booth was Lincoln's eventual assassin. So I went to town trying to find the truth on this. And in fact, John Wilkes Booth, as far as I could tell, never ever performed at the Fulton. And neither Thaddeus Stevens nor James Buchanan ever attended it in as audience members, so far as I could tell. They were there, they both spoke from the stage at different points, but I never found any record of them as audience members. So that was a disappointment. But Kingston's articles did some sort of a trick, because Lancaster did rally to save the Fulton. In 1962, members of a new nonprofit, the Fulton Opera House Foundation, bought the dilapidated old building for something like $50,000. And they started the long, costly process of renovating it. So my question to you tonight is, why? Why did the people of Lancaster rally in the 1960s to save, restore, and renovate the Fulton? Why in the mid-1990s did they pony up $9.5 million for another renovation of the Fulton? This time it was the 4th renovation of the theater. And you're looking at a sketch of the design for the curtain from that 1995 renovation. This expansion and renovation brought a new 4-story annex to the north of the theater, new ADA compliant dressing rooms, new lighting, sound, and fly systems, a studio theater, and a drastically improved and beautified stage and auditorium. It also brought a bar. That was exciting for Lancaster. And now, of course, the theater has grown again, this time at a cost of, it's staggering, $33.5 million, with yet another phase of the expansion in the works. Why? Oh, and as an aside, why does Lancaster also support another 6 performing arts organizations in the city? This is a city with a population of 60,000. I live in a city that's 100,000, and we don't have stuff like that. So take a minute, if you will, and just reflect quietly on this question. What does the Fulton Theater mean to you? You don't need to put it in chat necessarily, just hold on to it. I want to come back to it at the end in our Q&A. But what does the Fulton Theater mean to you? And if you happen to support it in some way, why do you actively invest in it? And for extra credit, and I thank Tom for this suggestion, you could also think about this question: what more could the Fulton do in the near or distant future to serve this community? So we'll come back to all of that. So let's start with the beginning. 1852. Fulton Hall, as it was then called, had its grand opening on October 14th, 1852. These openings all seem to happen in October, by the way. Speaking at that event, a Lancaster judge named Alexander Hayes said that by constructing Fulton Hall, his good friend Christopher Hager, a local dry goods merchant, had fulfilled, quote, a great desideratum of our community, a town hall. That word desideratum is not one you hear too much, but I'm glad I pronounced it. So this is indeed what Christopher Hager had in mind in 1852, when the city of Lancaster announced that it was going to tear down, or I'm sorry, it was going to sell its old jail, which was built of stone in 1730, and they were going to build a bigger jail east of town. So the civic-minded Hager decided that Lancaster needed a town hall, and he was going to build it, and he was going to name it after Lancaster native Robert Fulton. To me, it was an audacious move because I've always thought of this building and the ground on which it stands as a haunted place. And I'm not talking about spooky Halloween ghosts. As most of you know, the last of the Conestoga Indians were murdered inside the Lancaster jail in 1763 by a band of hell-bent vigilantes from the town of Paxton near Harrisburg. Conestogas had been put in that jail for their own protection after those same vigilantes had attacked their village in the south end of Lancaster County. The massacre itself gave rise to a primitive kind of theater, in fact, a colonial pamphlet war, which included a series of dialogues arguing the pros and cons of the killing. So if you think about that, 90 years before Christopher Hager built a theater on this piece of ground, it was already associated with a kind of theater. It was also a place for tourism. In the wake of the killings, the jail site became what we might today call a dark tourism place. In 1765, just a year after the massacre, the surveyor Charles Mason of Mason and Dixon fame visited Lancaster, and he went out of his way to see the jail. He said, "Here is where was perpetrated last winter the horrid and inhuman murder of 26 Indians, men, women, and children, leaving none alive to tell." So it was already kind of a place of spectacle. The future site of the Fulton Theater was haunted in another way too, as you can see from this list. The jail, between the time it was a jail or between the Paxton Massacre and the time Hager turned it into a theater and a town hall, the jail frequently housed African Americans who were trying to escape slavery, and you can see some of the names there. So this piece of ground, this future American theater, is implicated in what I consider the two great crimes this country was founded on: the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of African Americans. So what made Christopher Hager think that this might be a nice spot to put up a town hall? And why did Lancaster need a town hall? Well, you can look at the numbers. In 1852, Lancaster had a population of 12,000. It had a market, had a courthouse, it had 16 places of worship, and at least as many taverns, but it had no public hall. There was no place for secular congregation. There was no place for political rallies or lectures or concerts or theater, no place for culture. And if Americans wanted to do anything in the middle of the 19th century besides solve their huge social problems, they wanted to create a culture, an American culture that could rival Europe's. So Christopher Hager went out and he found an architect from Philadelphia named Samuel Sloan, who was enamored of all things Italian and who promptly designed a hall that resembled something you might find on the streets of Florence or Rome. And this is his sketch of Fulton Hall. Hager spent a total of around $30,000 to buy the old jail and turn it into a 4-story town hall. Now you might ask, why didn't he just tear down the jail and build a new? And I think my guess is that the architects from Tippett's Weaver would tell you what I'm about to tell you, which is that the ground between Prince Street and Water Street is incredibly uneven. And if somebody has figured out how to build a solid structure on that ground, and they've done it, you just don't tear it down and start from scratch and give yourself headaches. And for that reason, of course, the Fulton has what is, I'm pretty sure, is unique among American theaters. It has this remarkable old ghosted stone wall that you can see at the back of the theater on Water Street. So over 1,000 people turned out for the opening of Fulton Hall in October of 1852. The local Philharmonic Society played a polka that was written especially for the occasion. And as I've said, Judge Alexander Hayes gave, I think it was probably a pretty long speech. Among other things, Hayes voiced his hope that decorum would reign inside the Fulton's walls, and that its entertainment offerings would have an intellectual character. So I'll leave you to be the judge of how that's all worked out. The new Fulton Hall had 4 floors. The most elegant of those floors was on the 2nd story, was lit by 3 gas chandeliers and 32 wall jets. It had a platform at one end and a bunch of benches at the other end, and this was the theater. The very first production to play Fulton Hall was a minstrel show, a band of white performers in burnt cork blackface doing their best to paint a happy picture of Black life in pre-war America. So here we are. Blackface is obviously a complex and fraught phenomenon, as some of you may have read recently in the papers. It's way too complicated to go into in depth here. That merits an entire evening with Lancaster history. I just want to point out that at the time, 1850s, blackface was far more palatable to white audiences than real life Black performers would ever have been. And I'll also note that the popularity and prevalence of blackface minstrelsy during these years in the mid-19th century had everything to do with what was happening in the United States at the time. To put it simply, we were hurtling toward war over the issue of race-based slavery. And Fulton Hall was in the thick of it. In addition to minstrel shows, there were touring productions of Uncle Tom's Cabin, beginning in 1854 with this production starring a white actress in blackface, Rose Merrifield, as the enslaved Topsy. These shows, Uncle Tom's Cabin in particular, were of course first and foremost entertainment, but at the same time, Fulton Hall was already doing what theater always does, showing audiences an image of themselves and of their life and times. It was, in short, a staging ground. It was a place for Lancastrians to explore current events and past history, a place for revelation and reflection. Fulton Hall in the 1850s was also very literally helping to shape the country. Among the most important events to take place here in the building's first years were political debates and campaign rallies. Thaddeus Stevens was one of many who spoke from the Fulton stage about the issues of the day, notably in Stevens' case, slavery. Stevens also came to the Fulton in 1860 to campaign for the new Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln. And then war came, and Fulton Hall turned mostly into a military depot for groups like the Fencibles. There were a few productions in there interesting, but mostly it was really a depot. And then, as you know, the Civil War culminated in an act of theater, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln as he sat watching a production of Our American Cousin in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Our American Cousin was one of the first shows to play Fulton Hall after the war ended in early 1866. That is, the show played it in 1866, the war ended in 1865. A huge crowd turned out to see it. Maybe they were sparked by curiosity to see this kind of haunted play. But I'm 99.9% sure that among the people who turned out to see this show were men and women and children, perhaps, who had gone to the Lancaster Railroad Depot to see Lincoln's funeral train as it passed through town on its way to Illinois. So this, by the way, is Harrisburg, in case anybody's wondering. And the picture comes from Lancaster history, but you get the idea. And then this is another instance of the incredible overlap between art and life, spectacle and history that characterizes this remarkable and ghosted building, the Fulton. So in late 1865, shortly after the war's end, a local saddle maker named Blasius Yecker, I apologize for the blurriness of this image, but you get a sense of him. This guy Yecker, he was a saddle maker, got the idea that he should go into show business. So he bought Fulton Hall and he quickly reopened it. Well, he was up against it. Lots of Americans at the time, many Americans had always thought theater was a den of iniquity, but especially after Lincoln was murdered in Ford's Theater, theater really had a bad name. One minister said, and this is a quote, "Would that Mr. Lincoln had fallen elsewhere than at the very gates of hell, in the theater." end quote. So Blasius Yecker would spend many years working to convince Lancaster audiences that the Fulton was no hellgate, but instead a place of decorum and propriety. At the same time, he had to make money, and those two things don't always go hand in hand. One of my favorite stories about the Fulton is May Fisk. I found this little tiny article in the paper. I just love it. She came to the Fulton twice, 1878 and 1879. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit chronologically. And she came with her troupe of English blondes in a show called Our Naughty Girls. So in the performance in 1879, midway through the performance, somehow a fire alarm went off inside the Fulton Opera House, and the lights went out, and there was pandemonium among the audience. And one of May's blondes called out from the stage, "Don't worry, you don't have to leave the theater. Everything's okay. The drinks will be brought in." Fisk and her blondes never came back to the Fulton. But Yecker's biggest challenge at the very start of his ownership of the Fulton in 1866 was getting audiences and performers to come to the theater in the first place. Fulton Hall in 1866 was actually a bit of a mess. You know, it had been used as a depot for the previous 4 years. It had no real stage to speak of, just a platform at one end of a room. It had faulty ventilation, poor acoustics, shoddy dressing rooms, a cramped entrance, no balcony. It reeked of beer. People were already talking about just turning the place into a picture gallery. That's because post-war Americans wanted something more. They wanted pomp and spectacle. They wanted sumptuous decor, tiered seating, balconies. They wanted the Paris Opera. So Yecker did what Christopher Hager had done 20 years before. He went out and he hired an architect from Philadelphia. This time it was a man named Edwin Forrest Durang, who came from a long line of theater people. His grandfather was John Durang, the first theater professional born in the United States who made his career on the stage. And I'll put in a little plug for my friend Lynn Brooks, who's here tonight and has written John Durang's biography. John Durang was born in Lancaster, and there is a plaque in his honor behind the Fulton, or in that area on Water Street. So Edwin Durang, the architect, basically gutted the old multi-purpose Fulton Hall, and he turned it into a lavish opera house of the sort that audiences now wanted. He lowered the auditorium floor. He built a 54-foot wide stage with footlights and trapdoors. He took out the old platform and benches from Hager's Hall and brought in tiered seats upholstered in red terry cloth. He added a balcony. He hung a 6-foot wide chandelier with 54 gas burners, each one of which was backed by a reflector. He frescoed the ceiling with a portrait of Beethoven and 4 portraits of women dressed as the 4 seasons. Backstage, he installed an elaborate fly system, 2 furnaces, 10 dressing rooms, a pair of water closets, a green room, and a spiral staircase that I'm pretty sure was still doing duty when I worked at the Fulton in the 1970s and 80s. On stage, Durang hung a hand-painted drop curtain showing the Lake of Lugano. And I think if you look up at the very top of the building there, of the ceiling, you'll see that portrait of Beethoven as well. I suspect that the changes that Edwin Durang made to Fulton Hall were about as mind-boggling as the changes we've just seen, or you have, I haven't been in Lancaster in a while, made to the Fulton Theater in the last 2 years. But certainly the auditorium, which is, as I understand it, mostly unchanged from the 1995 renovation, owes a lot to Durang's vision. And this is a picture from the 1995 expansion. So at the grand reopening of the Fulton in 1873, back to 1873 now, the celebrated Shakespearean actor from Philadelphia, Edward Davenport, who, by the way, had refused to play Fulton Hall the previous year because it was so crummy. He now came to the theater and he told the crowd, "We have now one of the handsomest, if not the handsomest, opera house in the United States." And then he also said, "Fulton Hall is certainly a perfect little gem." Well, it's not so little anymore. Does anyone know, by the way, how many square feet the new Fulton complex encompasses? You're welcome to put your guesses in the chat. I'm going to spoil it and tell you right now before you guess. More than 131,000 square feet. Back to 1873. So Yecker's Gambit worked. Audiences came and performers. And for the next 30 years, the renamed Fulton Opera House, or Yecker's Fulton Opera House, enjoyed its first golden age. It was one of the major American roadhouses. So among the things people saw on the stage here were frontier plays, because Americans wanted to celebrate their newly unified country. And one way to do that was to focus on the frontier and the country's continuing expansion westward, which of course meant the continuing and bloody removal of indigenous people from their hunting lands. Lancaster audiences could see a sanitized version of that process right in front of them on the 6 occasions between 1873 and 1882, when Buffalo Bill came to the Fulton to perform. Now you have to imagine the spectacle. But this is a slide from a little later. It's probably when Buffalo Bill was coming to Lancaster with one of his Wild West shows. But this is truly a photograph of him in Lancaster with one of his bands of quote unquote live Indians. And I just want you to imagine the spectacle of this performer with Native Americans performing the massacre of Native Americans on a stage on top of the ground where the Conestogas perished in 1763. Another way to celebrate the newly unified United States was to bring back that old sawhorse Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's still today, I believe, the single most performed play in United States history. Post-war, producers they went nuts. They took this production to absurd lengths, partly because people were so bloody familiar with it. So they did things like, as you can see on this slide, they did double castings of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So there were 2 of everything, 2 bloodhounds, 2 Topsies, 2 Elizas. Among other things, these raucous new productions of this old play by now helped audiences ignore the real life brutality of American slavery and of post-Reconstruction racial violence. Instead, audiences could sit back and laugh at the spectacle of African-American performers in blackface, being funny. It was another way of grappling with the charged issue of race in a post-emancipation America. And by the way, it was common for African-American performers to black up. Even the gifted West Indian actor Burt Williams had to perform in blackface when he came to the Fulton in 1904. Williams was also expected to use what people called Negro dialect, even though he was highly educated and he actually had to learn it as if it were a foreign language like Italian. Women now also came to the Fulton in greater numbers, and with them came issues of gender and equality. Yecker obviously continued to bring in money-making leg shows like Mae Fisk, but he also brought the likes of Minnie Maddern Fisk. She's one of the great actresses and serious actresses of her age. She championed the work of Henrik Ibsen, among others. After her marriage, Minnie Maddern Fisk was expected to retire completely from professional life, but she actually hated domestic life. And so she went back on stage instead. And her first performance as Mrs. Fisk was here at the Fulton in 1895. A list of shows that went on the stage during Yecker's tenure at the Fulton from 1866 to 1903 kind of reads like a lesson in American history, culture, and society. There were shows about Mormons. There were shows about mixed race Americans. They were often called octoroons. In fact, one of the popular plays was called Octoroon. There were shows about immigrants, along with more conventional fare like Shakespeare. But again, here we have theater as not only entertainment, but also as identity, instruction, a kind of living newspaper. Nor did the Fulton stop functioning as a town hall. During these same years, local churches and synagogues and glee clubs all met inside the Fulton. I love this anecdote. James Buchanan's liquor collection was auctioned off here after his death in 1868. Social activists and political figures again took to the stage to promote their causes. One of them was Carrie Nation, a very mild-mannered looking woman, right? She came to the Fulton in 1903 with her whiskey bottle smashing act. And then after she was on the Fulton stage smashing bottles, she went to a couple of local taverns to do it, and they had to call out the cops. And in 1874, really fascinating American figure, Victoria Woodhull, first female candidate for president of the United States. She came to the Fulton. She spoke to a crowd of maybe 20 people, and they were all women. And the intelligentsia, as you can see here, called her talk vile. So you know what happened next, right? Screens. Not that we would know anything today about their power. Actually, vaudeville came first, and then motion pictures. The first movies began playing the Fulton in the 1890s. See if I can get this to work. And you had people like Buffalo Bill, who had appeared here in 3 dimensions as a human being, as a real live actor. All of a sudden, here he is in 2 dimensions, hanging from a little, piece of fabric hanging on over the Fulton stage. Audiences were enthralled. And poor Blasius Yecker was powerless to stop it. Moving pictures or movies coupled with the onset of vaudeville led to the long, slow demise of the Fulton. So Blasius Yecker himself, and you can see him here, and his son Charles. Blasius Yecker died in 1903, and his son Charles took over the theater, but Charles struggled. He was desperate to accommodate the growing audience demand for spectacle on a grand scale. And so Charles Yecker went out and hired the person who's going to be the topic of one of the next talks at Lancaster History, C. Emlyn Urban. Yecker hired him to do a massive overhaul of the Fulton in 1904. So this, by my count, is the 3rd major renovation since the construction of Fulton Hall in 1852. Urban reshaped the proscenium. He added a 2nd balcony with a smoking room and toilet conveniences, whatever those are. I have a picture of the balcony. It's a contemporary picture. I don't have a picture of those toilet conveniences. Urban enlarged the orchestra pit. He added 8 new boxes to the auditorium, and he turned the front of the theater into a lobby. And so into this new theater, Charles Yecker brought even more outlandish spectacle in a desperate bid to try to get audiences to come. At one point, they staged a real-life live wedding on stage. And then somewhat famously, he brought this just exorbitant production of Ben-Hur to the Fulton in 1907. That production had something like 100 actors and 8 live horses on turntables galloping towards the audience. It also had a live camel. Don't know where that one stayed when it was for overnight. Didn't work. Lancaster wanted movies. So in 1930, under new management, the Fulton Theater, which was no longer called an opera house, announced that from here on out, with very few exceptions, it would present only motion pictures. And that's what it did. Same thing was happening all across the country. By 1933, some 70 million Americans were attending movies weekly in the country's 14,000 houses for movies that were devoted exclusively to moving pictures. Lancaster alone had, in addition to the Fulton, it had 3 more movie theaters in the early 20th century. So here we are, that facade that many of us remember from our childhoods. So continued to be a movie house until 1959, pretty much exclusively movies. And then in 1959, for some reason, they decided to put on a live show, and they presented Thornton Wilder's Our Town. The theater by then was in such terrible shape that actors got dressed in plywood cubicles in an unheated scene dock, and the auditorium itself had to be washed down before every performance. So it's not entirely surprising that people were talking about tearing it down. It was also the 60s when the city took down the Brunswick Hotel, urban renewal. I remember it. It was a big, big thing. But Lancaster rallied. You guys rallied. Fulton Opera House Foundation raised enough money to save the theater from the wrecking ball in the mid-1960s. In 1969, and forgive this blurry slide, in 1969, the Fulton was designated a registered National Historic Landmark, so that was greater protection for the building. Many of you, I'm sure, will remember that the theater continued to show movies in the 1960s and 70s, I think possibly into the 80s. But increasingly, the Fulton reclaimed its old role as a venue for live theater. There were summer rep seasons, productions by Actors Company and other local troupes. There were touring productions. It was all part of the long, often arduous journey to get to where we are today. I do think it's a new golden age. So here we are at the completion of the first two phases of a $33.5 million expansion, the fifth major renovation in the Fulton's history. More than 1,000 households, and that word includes corporations, contributed to this campaign, and hats off to you. And there are plans for a final phase, the conversion of what's known as Rita's House, which is on the corner of King and Prince. It's the last bit of the block that has not yet been Fultonized, right? That's going to be turned into more box office and customer service space. The new 2021 Fulton has a new black box theater, the Chamber Theater. It has a new multi-purpose space, Castagna Hall, which can also be used as a theater. Together with the main stage and the Tell Studio Theater, which was part of the 1995 expansion, the Fulton now has a total of 4 spaces that can be used to present works of theater. That's extraordinary. Today's Fulton Theater Complex also has 16 on-site apartments that are capable of housing at least 20 actors, designers, production staff members when they are in town working on shows. And it has, among many other things, 27 new restrooms. So you can see them here. I don't have a photograph of them, but really a round of applause for that. I think we all appreciate those. But I was struck just doing some noodling around on the web about this new Fulton. I was really struck by something that Executive Artistic Director Mark Robin said, and it is this, and I'll put the quote up here. A primary goal of the expansion project, Robin said, was to increase our ability to gather our community. So here we are, back to that old original role that Christopher Hager had in mind, a town hall. With this new complex, the number of community gathering spaces inside the Fulton has risen from 4 to 11. So there is space now for many community meetings, weddings, galas, receptions, and other events. The Fulton proved its community credentials during the first months of the pandemic, as many of you know. Staff members collaborated with the Lancaster School District to provide a virtual arts curriculum for kids. Members of the Fulton production team, this is so lovely, helped make face masks, shields, and gowns for the medical community. And the new Fulton is also revisiting its historic role as a staging ground, a place where audiences can confront and reflect on the critical issues of the day. This past summer, through its inaugural Stories of Diversity Playwriting Festival, the Fulton presented 3 new plays that raised questions about equity, equality, and the systemic racism that continues to plague our country. I very much like what the Fulton website has to say about this role, and it is this: the Fulton Theater continues to be committed to being a change through the stories we tell on our stage. Bravo. So this seems as good a place as any to stop and ask, what does the Fulton Theater mean to you today? And where might you like to see it go in the near and or distant future? Because clearly this story is not over. Quick thank you to these people who have been really helpful in preparing and helping me prepare this talk. And just a note that I'd be happy to hear from you, and that is my email. And I think with that, I will stop the share and turn it over to Tom. And I think we left about 20 minutes.
I think you're right.
Did anybody have anything to say?
Great. Thank you, Leslie. Yes, a number of folks have some questions for you. One quick one. Do you know whether W.C. Fields ever appeared on stage at the Fulton?
I think he did. He definitely was there in the movies. I'm pretty sure he appeared there as well. And I should give credit to Ty Greiner, whom I haven't talked to in many years, but who compiled this extraordinary document, which I believe is in your collection, with just listing all of the stuff that played at the Fulton. So, you know, people, audience members can go and search that out.
Great. So here's an interesting fact. Within about 5 years or less, either side of when the Fulton was created in the 1850s, you have the arrival of a whole series of new buildings in Lancaster. It's kind of a building boom. So just shortly before, you have the Conestoga steam mills that are built, and then Old Main at Franklin and Marshall, the county jail on East King Street, the county courthouse, all kind of major public buildings of one sort or another. And then right in the midst of that, you have the Fulton Theater. I don't know whether this pattern is repeated in other cities around the country in right around 1850. But do you know of other historic theaters being built around this time? One of our attendees tonight singled out the Grand Opera House in Wilmington as a comparable institution, but I don't know quite when that was established. So
I'm going to confess that I spent most of my time researching this particular theater. So I mean, I'm sure the phenomenon is real, and I'm sure it happened elsewhere. I'm trying to think of, you know, like Aspen, Colorado, there's wonderful theater there. And then there's funny Leadville down the road where that theater got sort of dilapidated. But I think it seems to me that they, you know, that sort of coincidence of a building boom and a theater boom. I mean, we all know, and I can't say it enough, theaters are economic generators. You know, culture brings in money, and so that, you know, just the whole, it's what the boat lifts all boats. It is interesting, those steam mills, which were cotton mills, right? Mm-hmm. And I've always been fascinated that Thaddeus Stevens was a big fan of those cotton mills, and yet, you know, they were connected. I mean, where was the cotton coming from? But those cotton mills were very much part of, I think, if I remember correctly, Hager was somewhat invested in them, but those cotton mills helped create the money that paid for construction of Fulton Hall. So there's definitely an overlap. But thank you for bringing that up, and that's a topic for further exploration for sure.
So here's an interesting question. Do you know whether there was a Jim Crow section at the Fulton Theater, either when it was a community meeting place or at any of these other iterations as you go through time?
Certainly performers, African-American performers like Bert Williams, who came to the Fulton, would have been put, I'm pretty sure, in Lancaster in segregated hotel housing. That was the pattern for him. I mean, he was a brilliant actor and he was super famous and extremely gifted, and yet he was put in segregated housing pretty much wherever he went. So I have to imagine that that would have been the case. My understanding has always been that what we might call the peanut gallery, or the area of the Fulton, which I think they still sell as seats, but also it's used for lighting and spotlights. And that would have been the second balcony that was put in by Urban in 1904, and that seemingly had a separate entrance. Some of these things, you know, the architects have told me what a maze it is, M-A-Z-E, that whole block, and it's sort of maze-like and, you know, tricky to find your way around and all these different levels. Well, that's kind of what researching this building was like for me, because it's a palimpsest, and things, you know, were, I mean, as with all renovations, things would be incorporated into the new building. You know, we don't have a great visual record of the Fulton at its various stages, which I regret. But that's always been my understanding, is that top gallery, and you can see it's rough wood, wooden benches, you know, they weren't getting the upholstered seats. So yeah, that's my understanding, that that's what that was for.
A little note on that upper balcony. There's actually a third one above that, which is where there's even more lighting than in the second balcony. But the main balcony and the one above it is suspended from the ceiling.
Yeah.
So you look at that highest one when you're standing on the stage, it's literally cabled to the structure up above. And I believe it's the only suspended gallery in a theater in the country, at least of an historic theater.
And I'm guessing that that was Durang. And I remember when I was working on this book, wonderful architect Dick Levengood, who may be here tonight, took me through the theater and showed me just architecturally what was going on. And one of the things that just blew my mind was, I mean, the weight of adding a balcony to that building. And when you go down into the basement, you can still see it, these incredible piers, these old wood piers that held up the floor. I mean, just the engineering that goes into that building is mind-boggling.
You know, Leslie, you mentioned earlier the theater as the gates of hell.
That's a quote, not me.
No, I got that. Yeah, but also theater as a showplace, a place to entertain. But you've also mentioned theater as a mirror, a place that where we see ourselves, we see our society. Some would also say that by seeing ourselves more clearly, we might learn where we need to change or have to change. One comment from one of our participants or our viewers tonight, the Fulton is a safe place where current issues can be explored and discussed. So proud the Fulton is taking a chance with Fun Home, the show that most recent show. Can you say a word about the role of theater in a community and dig a little deeper into that?
Well, it may be, that may be one of the main reasons I wanted to write this book, because I'm just endlessly fascinated by it. I'm not sure I have like I don't have a single answer to that. I'm thrilled, more than thrilled. I'm just so heartened to hear that that an audience member would say that about the Fulton, that it's a safe space, because that's a really hard thing to achieve. To have trust between audience and the production staff and audience and the performers and all of that. I mean, there's so many ways now that theaters and cultural organizations approach that role that, you know, the original Fulton didn't, right? So you get all of these educational packages, audience talkbacks, you know, pre-show conversations, stuff like that, to help sort of contextualize and give audiences the opportunity to talk back or to discuss and reflect on. But yeah, it's, we see ourselves up there, right? And actors have this incredible power. I mean, one of the weird things about blackface, actually, and masks and costumes in general, is that they are so liberating. So you get up on the stage, you put on a costume. You don't even have to put on a costume. You can just get up. You get up on the stage. Something happens. You can do anything. You can kill people. You can, you know, commit all sorts of acts of violence or whatever. You can kiss. You can fall in love. Whatever. And it's licensed, right? Theater. So that's one of the reasons, of course, people thought it was the gates of hell. But it also means we can. I think that makes it in many ways a safe space, right? Like that stage itself is a safe space where audiences can sit back and watch frightening, disturbing, miraculous things happen and feel safe. And it gives you a kind of distance to think about those things. So I guess that's one place I would go with that. But that is an incredible statement to make about the Fulton. And that is an incredible tribute to the production staff of that theater right now, that is the case.
Well, I think especially now with multiple venues, we've known for a while, there's the upstairs series, the Ellen Groff series, which is a smaller setting. You can take chances there that you might not be able to take on the main stage for financial reasons. You've got to sell tickets to make the theater survive. I want to go back a little bit in history, in time, with one of the questions from our viewers. Do you know what inspired Yecker's interest in the theater? Was his taste reflected in the choice of the acts? And finally, so this is a three-part question, did it work financially for him? So Yecker's interest in theater, where did that come from? Was his taste reflected in the shows and the acts that appeared, and did he make money?
I have no idea what made him think he could, he wanted to be like Barnum, I think. And I've never been able to figure that out. The guy came over here in 1848. I think he was a teenager. He was a German immigrant, and he trained as a saddler. Now, I don't think you get rich making saddles, except there was this thing called the Civil War. And I was never able to conclusively prove it, but I'm, pretty certain what happened is he must have been, he was supplying the army and making money, because somehow between, he's nobody. And then all of a sudden, 1865, he's got enough money to buy the Fulton and go into show business. Why he wanted to go, I have no idea. I spent a long time talking to his descendants. They were just sort of fascinated by the guy, but really didn't know. I would say his taste I don't know what his taste was. He was, well, I will say this, he made a great point of being a sort of proper citizen. He was a member of the Select City Council. At one point, his name was being floated as mayor. So he was very careful to have a good image in town. He was Catholic, literally Catholic, like St. Joseph's. He had, I think, 6 kids. And I think he really did try to very hard consistently to make the Fulton seem like a place of decorum and sort of upstanding citizenry, although he had to pay the bills, so he would bring in those leg shows. And I think he did okay financially. He died just as the thing was really going downhill thanks to movies. And his poor son Charles managed the theater for a few years, and I have to imagine the stress. I think the stress of it just killed him. He was walking home from the theater one day, young man in his 40s, I think, and just dropped dead from a stroke, and that was it. So it really took it out on his son. But I think Yecker did okay. He was able to go back to Europe. I think he traveled out west at one point. So I think he did okay financially. But I've never known, was he more of a showman than a business guy? But when other people came in and tried to run it, they just didn't do very well. Yecker was pretty beloved, it seems.
Okay. Your comment about saddles and a saddler possibly getting increasing wealth during the Civil War. We know that in Lancaster, Lancaster is one of the early rifle manufacturing places in the country. And there were a number of federal contracts for Union arms being made that certainly increased the wealth of a number of Lancastrians who were in that business. So here's a 2-part question, and it's on the one hand, it's about economic development and how a theater really can help revitalize a city, but it also kind of looks at the underbelly of that and the question of gentrification. So the 90s renovation, the theater was really at a crossroads. Those renovations were questioned at the time. The expense seemed exorbitant. And yet it set the course for a very successful 25 years until this next renovation and additions. But then, does this expansion accelerate gentrification in downtown Lancaster, and what are the costs to the community in that regard?
Yeah, I actually wish we could open the floor, and I'd love to hear from people who are living there now. I'm because of COVID, I haven't been in Lancaster for a couple of years, and I'm really curious to see how it's changing. I know Willow Valley is moving in. I don't have a good answer to that. Gentrification is a charged issue. Often involves race and moving lower income people out of places and turning them into places for wealthy people to come in. And that is an extremely difficult question and a problematic process. On the other hand, I remember Lancaster when I was a kid, and not even later, with boarded up buildings. And I mean, the Watt and Shan sat there, empty for all those years. I don't think we want a city like that either. So what is the answer? Ann Arbor grapples with this too. I mean, we've gotten so out of sight. Affordable housing is constantly on the ballot in one way or another, and we never seem to be able to solve it. So I'm not sure, that's a terrible answer. I think it's just a really complicated process. My understanding, by the way, about the 1995 renovation, if I'm remembering correctly, was that was actually prompted by, there were sort of HVAC issues and compliance issues with Americans with Disability Act and that sort of thing, that the Fulton really basically, I mean, had to pony up money to fix these issues. And so therefore, you know, it moved into this renovation. Otherwise, it wasn't going to be able to continue operating, is my understanding. You might double check that. Yeah. But that sort of lends a little bit of complexity to that decision.
And you don't have to have the answers to all the questions tonight, Leslie. And gentrification is a really, I mean, it's as you're pointing out, it's a complex series of maneuvers and realities. And so it's great that we have this forum for folks in this community to raise that question and not just say what a wonderful thing it is that we have the Fulton, but then let's ask ourselves what are the costs that come with a gentrification within our town.
And I'll just pop in and say, I think also that is that speaks to this whole question of the Fulton's role in the community and community service as part of its, you know, a vital part of its mission.
Another comment: people love culture. They love what it has, what it brings to the community, and it brings us together. That's what I feel the Fulton Opera House brings to us. And then there's a follow-up. This is from a different individual. Why is Lancaster such a hub for the many theatrical organizations as well as performing sites that we have? Want to take a stab at that?
That's my question. And, you know, like I'm in Ann Arbor. We're, you know, many miles away from, you know, Detroit down the road, but then Chicago, whatever. You guys are, you know, an hour from Philly, an hour from Baltimore, 2 hours Washington, 2.5, 3 to New York. I mean, culture is not, you know, it's within reach. I mean, you have to have means and transportation, but it is within reach. And it's incredible to me that the city, you know, supports culture to the extent that it does, which says something about how Lancastrians want to live. There's certainly the social aspect of it. I mean, you see one another in these venues, or we did before COVID. You know, there's that. But I think it's also, you know, I put the question out to you because I just think, yeah, it's a really interesting question. Not every city is like this. Ann Arbor struggled for years to try to build something like the Fulton. I mean, not a building like the Fulton, but a theater, a resident theater. Never really happened. Yeah.
Well, I'm grateful for the asker of that question that kind of pushes us to figure out why so many performing arts operations do we have. There's a whole other area of artistic expression, which is art itself and painting, sculpture, and so forth. And I have my own theory on why Lancaster is such a rich hothouse for that, but that will be for another night. I appreciate so much the questions that all of you have sent in. I wish we could have gotten to all of them. There are a few that remain, but we're really at the end of our hour. I want to thank you, Leslie, for a wonderful kind of walk through history, but also challenging us to think about what a theater means in a community today, what it can do for our community tomorrow. I want to thank everyone who attended tonight, and also let you know that upon leaving this Zoom, there's a window will pop up and it'll be a post-event survey. And we'd like you to, it's completely voluntary. We'd love to know your thoughts about this presentation tonight and the conversation that followed. We'd also like to know what you'd like to hear about in the future. We'll be posting a recording of this presentation on our YouTube in the upcoming days, so stay tuned for that. And if you have friends that couldn't make it, you can let them know they can see it on YouTube. You can also register now for our November colloquium, C. Emlyn Urban, Lost and Found, with our own Greg Scott. The lecture will be Thursday, November 18th at 7 o'clock, and you can register at our website, LancasterHistory.org. With that, again, Leslie, thank you. Thank you to our audience, and everyone have a pleasant evening.
Thanks for those great questions.
All right. Good night. Thank you, Leslie.